Semiconductors, or chips, are the quiet foundation of the global economy. It's difficult to overstate their importance. Microscopic in size, their impact is immense, and they've insinuated themselves into every aspect of our daily lives, found in everything from the family car to your home refrigerator. A perfect storm of factors created in part by the pandemic, including capacity reductions, unpredictable manufacture demand, changes in consumer behavior, and shifting global dynamics have left businesses scrambling for supplies. The worldwide chip shortage has already impacted on the bottom line of numerous household brands and laid bare the central importance of semiconductor technology across the whole of the manufacturing ecosystem. It's within this context that we're pleased to bring you an exclusive Reuters Events discussion brought to you in partnership with our session sponsor, Huawei Technologies USA, looking at the future of technology supply chains. And I'm delighted to say that with me, I have the perfect guests to help shine a light on this complex but hugely important topic. Andy Purdy is Chief Security Officer at Huawei Technologies USA, where he oversees Huawei USA's Cybersecurity Assurance Program. Previously, Andy worked at the US Department of Homeland Security and was the senior cybersecurity official of the US government from 2004 to 2006. Prior to joining the DHS, he was a member of the White House staff, where he helped to draft the US national strategy to secure cyberspace, after which he went to the DHS, where he helped to form and then led the National Cybersecurity Division and the US Computer Emergency Readiness Team. Immediately prior to joining Huawei, Andy Purdy was the Chief Cybersecurity Strategist for Computer Sciences Corporation. Great you could join us, Andy. My second guest is Glenn O'Donnell, VP Research Director for Forrester, leads the team researching automation, data center technologies, networking, the Internet of Things, and edge computing. He's widely regarded as a top thought leader in technology development and operations, automation, and the broader social implications of technology evolution. His own current research themes focus on technology dependability, automating operations in IT and beyond, technology provider viability, and 5G wireless issues. He revels in fighting the status quo and finding comfort outside his comfort zone. Welcome to you, Glenn. Let's see if we can all step outside of our comfort zones comfortably today, shall we?
Let's do that. Thank you.
So, Glenn, we'll start with a bit of context, and if I could begin with you. I think it'd be good to start with supply and demand in the semiconductor industry. Would you mind outlining the health of the sector?
Yeah, well, we're living in a world where everything is just full of semiconductors, chips from big to small. And if it's got a plug or a battery, it's probably full of chips. And this is toys, you mentioned smart refrigerators now. We seem to have gone a bit crazy with some of this stuff, but it's a fact of life that everything is now enabled by these semiconductors. So demand has been steadily climbing. And there are a lot of large power players in this business. A lot of the technology names that we've come to know are supplying these chips. But the problem is right now we've got an imbalance of supply and demand. We've got more demand than we have supply. This was exacerbated by the pandemic, but this was happening before the pandemic hit. And what happened with the pandemic is a lot of the economy went down, shut down. Therefore, they didn't need as many chips. So the focus on manufacture and delivery of chips went elsewhere, to cloud providers, to PCs. PCs just took off like a rocket during the pandemic for obvious reasons. People work at home, they need a decent PC. So we've got a severe imbalance, and now we're faced with this issue of, automobile manufacturing has come almost to a screeching halt in some places because they cannot get the chips. And there are a whole lot of factors that play into that. But this is a situation that's going to be with us, I believe, for at least 2 years, because it takes a long time to rebuild that supply to meet the demand that we're facing.
Andy, so Glenn, you talk about the challenges about supply and demand and shortages in the global technology semiconductor supply chain. Well, of course, we're now well advanced into the fourth industrial revolution, a revolution with its own particular characteristics and indeed needs. How do these challenges affect this, and what are the benefits, and how important a role do semiconductors play?
Well, I think Glenn has given us a pretty good clue of how important a role the semiconductors play. And we're talking about a situation where the world has benefited from relatively free trade, from increased competition, from innovation, that's helped lead to a very diversified supply chain, where the Semiconductor Industry Association has said that there are 50 places in the world that specialize in particular aspects of the supply chain. Each has more than 65% of the global market share. So the reality of this distributed supply chain is a fact, and we've all benefited from it. So while there are some needs that have to be implemented so that countries can have chips when they need them, when there are catastrophic things that happen, we have to remember that we can't disrupt the entire supply chain. It's estimated that it would cost $1 trillion to take the global supply chain and try to locate it in one country. We have to recognize that competition and free trade have spawned greater innovation, and that's the context for the fourth industrial revolution, where computing power is going to be brought to the edge for the benefit of individuals and organizations. So you'll have sensors to machine communications, automation, big data analytics, artificial and augmented intelligence that are going to help improve the effort to, for example, fight climate change and to bring greater 5G-enabled healthcare and greater efficiency in manufacturing. And so we have to be careful not to have issues that come up, political issues or otherwise, inadvertently disrupt the supply chain, disrupt this process that is leading to such great benefits for so many people.
So, Glenn, Andy's obviously outlined his view on this. Let's talk about the potential impacts on the wider economy, industry, and please let's not forget consumers. What will happen if global semiconductor supply chains continue to be disrupted?
Yeah, well, Andy's right that the nature of supply chains, and the supply chains are actually pretty long in semiconductors. There's equipment that you need to build semiconductors. There are the raw materials for semiconductors. So if at any point along that chain, we've got some disruption, whatever it may be, it could be an economic or a political crisis, could be just that one of the companies is struggling, we have a vulnerability. And I think that's what we've seen come to the forefront here, is the vulnerabilities of how we've managed supply chains in the past. So this has a ripple effect through the entire economy, and there are potential secondary effects. If, say, John Deere cannot get the chips for its tractors, that impacts farming. And you may think, well, that's pretty far-fetched, but hey, farming's become a very high-tech profession. It's not what we've come to believe as some hick on a tractor and just doing a few acres. This is a very high-tech thing. And most of our food supply comes from high-tech farming. Well, if we have a disruption in the chips, that has a disruption in the equipment that the farmers are using, that has a disruption in the food supply, that's not that far-fetched when you really think about it. So we have this ripple effect takes place through the entire economy. People think, well, these chips, who cares? We don't see them; they're hidden inside. And that's part of the genius of the engineering that's been done in the past, is that we have been able to make them invisible. But boy, if you take them out, a lot of stuff stops working. The entire economy suffers as a result.
Andy, Glenn's obviously outlined specific industries there and what he thinks will happen. Have you got any specific examples? It'd be really good to get your perspective on this.
Well, I think the issues that we're talking about are exacerbated by geopolitical issues. Access to the supply chain, access to markets. And so there has been concern raised about what the impact is going to be on the ability of companies to buy and the ability to maintain sales of particular companies. So, for example, there's a concern that some of the actions are going to lead to a decoupling between China and the U.S. So the Boston Consulting Group found that if there's a full decoupling, it could result in a revenue loss of 16 to 37%. And the U.S. semiconductor global share could drop from 48% to 30%. U.S. Chamber of Commerce has said we're talking potentially about a loss of $83 billion in revenue to U.S. companies and 124,000 jobs. So those kinds of things have prompted concerns by other parts of the world about their ability to buy components. So, for example, the Europeans, the Japanese, South Korean companies have started to somewhat reduce the American components or the components that have flown from America into their products so that they can be assured of having the supplies that they need. So we need to take a breath, we need to take a pause, and we need to think about what has helped bring us to a very good place and how can we collaborate to bring the benefits of the technology while also addressing very real risks. And I think we really all need to work together on this.
Yeah, I agree. I agree wholeheartedly. We've got a nasty situation right now with the tensions, not just between the U.S. and China, but it spans other countries, and we've got to relax a lot of that. The supply chain demands that we have a free and open trade policy around the world, and that is at threat right now. I worry that it could exacerbate this whole situation. So I think Andy and I share a common view on that.
Yeah, you certainly do, because the relationships between these nations is so important, obviously, as you both outlined. So, if we look at that, and you say that we're in a really nasty situation, you've mentioned decoupling, how can individual governments cultivate the better relationships clearly needed to work together? Andy, I'll come to you first with this. And how do you think institutions themselves can effectively foster collaboration with the technology supply chain, taking into account these problems that we've just been discussing?
I think the collaboration is key, as you say, and there is an important role for government, but the role for the private sector is critically important. So within a particular nation, the importance of the government collaborating with the private sector to help figure out how can the path toward 5G-enabled technologies, toward the fourth industrial revolution, how can they be facilitated? So, for example, a government doesn't want to charge too much for spectrum because then the companies may not have the money that's necessary to invest. The governments may want to work, and sometimes it's a national level, state level, or municipality level, to figure out, well, how can the companies save money? Can they co-locate their base stations, for example, so that they can save money, avoid regulatory hurdles, and try to move forward? In addition, individual governments need to work collaboratively internationally to help strengthen the path toward common standards, because having diverse standards like we had in the early days of wireless are going to hurt everybody. So coming up with standards, coming up with conformance programs, and coming up with independent testing. And we'll get to the security piece a little bit later, but that importance of collaborating by governments with the private sector internally and externally is critically important.
It certainly is critical. Now, if we move on to looking a little bit more into the future, Glenn, let's look at R&D. What is the effect on R&D and future technologies if there's no clear way for companies to collaborate across borders?
Well, anybody who's worked in an R&D organization, and I have, realizes that you're not going to create the best things just by doing it yourself. There are a handful of geniuses out there who could pull that off, but there aren't many, and even they are smart enough to collaborate. So collaboration, in international standards bodies, collaboration in other communities has become the norm. And you see this so much with software, for example. Open source software is community developed, and it's become a robust and healthy way to do innovation. And just the cycle, the pace of innovation you can do by collaborating and exchanging ideas is what we need in this world. Everything's moving so quickly that you have to. So that means we have to collaborate across borders. We have to collaborate frequently amongst competitors. Andy and I might be competitors, but if we're pursuing a new standard for, say, 5G, it behooves us both to work together on that, and then we'll compete in the marketplace. So this so-called co-opetition is the norm now in the tech industry, and it's going to become even more so. And I think the governments themselves have to look at that too. How are two countries going to compete in the world stage but still cooperate? That's necessary. We have to figure out how to do that. You can't just take your ball and go home.
Yeah, I would add an exclamation point to something that Glenn said. Individual companies collaborate. They can collaborate in joint innovation centers for research and development. For example, coming up with 5G innovation projects within individual nations. There can be governments and private companies and academia working together to figure out what are some special things that might have particular value within that particular nation and might position themselves well to be competitive in the world. But the concept I think we're really seeing in innovation is one that collaboration can bring shared value. It's not about one company making a lot of money. It's various combinations of companies can work together to bring value, and organizations and consumers around the world benefit from this.
Absolutely.
On that point, Andy, I think it's time that we address the issues around national security, given your expertise and background. What's your take on how security concerns should be addressed going forward without disrupting those ways that companies best work together to drive essential innovation?
Well, I think it's important that everybody recognize, and I think pretty much everybody does recognize the fact that innovation and security have to go hand in hand, that it's not a zero-sum game. You can't say, oh, well, we're going to have innovation and we're going to forgo security. I mean, we see this particularly with some of the recent very significant cyber attacks with SolarWinds and the Microsoft Exchange server, the recent pipeline company ransomware attacks have been very significant. So a recognition that we have to come up with and strengthen common standards and best practices. For example, in telecom, one of our businesses, the Nessus, the Network Equipment Security Assurance Scheme, we and our competitors work together to develop those standards and independent testing. But the idea of focusing on what is really important, let's get rid of some of the legacy ideas like trusted supplier, which SolarWinds and the Exchange server cases showed. Trusted suppliers can be breached also. So we need to raise the bar generally on cybersecurity. And I think two of the critical things that are important is there needs to be greater transparency. There needs to be an ability to know whether it's a supplier or an operator, whether they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And we have to have greater accountability. There need to be concrete consequences for individual organizations to do what they're responsible for doing. But I also think on the international stage, there's some things that can be considered to try to have governments attest that they're going to do certain things and global companies attest and then hold them accountable if there's non-conformance.
Glenn, Andy has obviously mentioned one of the crucial words that I feel we need to discuss, which is trust, trust, trust. How do companies ensure the right amount of trust to move forward? Andy's given his perspective on this, because if we have to move forward in some form or another, we really do have to move forward, don't we?
We do.
No question. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, we definitely have to move forward, and it is about trust. And how do you build trust, and how do you ensure trust? Trust is something I think we've lost touch with to a great extent through our society, our global society, and we have to get back to that. Is there such thing as a trusted partner in the technology world? I think Andy proved the point with the SolarWinds thing that, all right, we're going to trust SolarWinds as a supplier. Well, they got breached. Okay, that means everybody who trusted them got some vulnerability there. So what we look at Forrester, and we created this concept of zero trust, basically trust no one from the technology perspective. And what do you do to build in the security for that kind of thing? And there are a lot of details we can go into, but the bottom line is you really don't have any trusted partners in that sense. But trust is still important in doing business. And you make promises and you keep promises. And if you do that, you build trust. And if you break a promise, you can destroy trust overnight. So it's really about making these commitments and the promises around them, and delivering on those promises. That goes for commercial entities. It goes for interpersonal relationships. You and I, if we want to build trust, it's a lot of promises. But it also applies to governments, and that's where it gets a lot stickier, because I think we still, around the world, we still view international relations as a bit like we did in World War II, where it's us versus them. And we have to get away from that us and them mentality. And we're one planet. Let's collaborate and get along here. Easier said than done, of course.
It is. It's about humans. Sorry, Andy. I just wanted to say it's about humans and their behavior, really, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yeah, I want to commend Forrester for their contribution to this path forward for the maturation of concepts of security with the idea of zero trust. This is a very important evolution, and we see that some of it is coming into play in more concrete ways. So the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. federal government are going to use these principles where they avoid the concepts of a perimeter, where you're going to set up the perimeter wall and block people because the bad guys can get in. So the idea of a continuous evaluation, the old method of trust but verify, is long gone. There has to be a trust through verification, a continuous attestation, a continuous verification as you go through the processes, and microsegmentation of networks. So if there's a breach, you can limit the harm. But I think it's also going to require greater efforts by government and the private sector working together to create more transparency. And I think the Germans are taking a very important step in that way, where they're holding the telecom operators responsible for doing certain kinds of things, and to make sure that their suppliers, including telecom equipment suppliers, have certain requirements that they meet. And those telcos need visibility into what the equipment suppliers do, so they can do their job of holding us and our competitors responsible. And they can point out where there are problems. In addition, the German government, holds the equipment suppliers, as one example, responsible to do certain kinds of things. And if those things are not met, there will be financial consequences and there will be accountability for that. So that idea of trying to increase transparency and accountability is, I think, part of this very important path forward. And I think the lessons that will be learned from SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange Server, I think, are going to hold us in good stead.
So, gentlemen, as we come to the end of our conversation, what I'm really interested to hear both of your thoughts on the future. Andy, you've given a little bit there, a prediction, if you like, as we try and look into the crystal ball. Andy, what's your prediction for how this will all play out, given all the points that we've been talking about during this discussion?
Well, I think powerful forces in the world recognize the benefits of free and fair trade, recognize the benefits of assurance, transparency, and accountability. And so forces will want to get the benefits that will flow from freer trade, from reduced risk. And so I think there will be a path forward as U.S. government, others, private companies help identify requirements to make cyberspace safer and more accountable. There will be progress toward maintaining that openness and that fairness and that accountability that has helped bring us to this point where the future can be so bright, as long as we don't get in the way of ourselves.
And what about you, Glenn? What's your predictions?
Well, I agree with Andy that cooler heads will prevail because they have to. If we are going to thrive as a global society, free and fair trade will still be there, and it has to be, because no one nation can do it themselves, no one company can do it themselves. This has to be a collaboration, especially as we continue to evolve the technologies. And again, that's evolving at a blistering pace. We've got 7.5 billion people on the planet, but we've got in a few years hundreds of billions of connected things, little gadgets that are doing everything from, it could be as silly as a light bulb to as critical as something that controls the fuel pipeline for the east coast of the U.S. There's a lot of technology embedded here. There's going to be a lot more demand for silicon. We have to increase that capacity to do that. It's going to take a few years, But this has to be a collaboration across companies and across countries. There's no other way to really pull this off.
There certainly isn't. Well, that concludes our exclusive Reuters Events discussion brought to you in partnership with our session sponsor, Huawei Technologies USA, looking at the future of technology supply chains. Andy Purdy, Chief Security Officer at Huawei Technologies USA, and Glenn O'Donnell, VP Research Director for Forrester. Thanks so much for your contributions. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you both, and an absolute pleasure. I've been your moderator, Nadira Tudor. Thank you for watching.